Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Maura Rinn, Chair of the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. I'd like to welcome you to the third webinar in the Taking Care of Yourself and Your Loved One series. This series is designed to help support the mental health and well-being of our faculty, staff, trainees, and students. Today's topic is understanding alcohol substance use among our teens and young adults. As I'm sure many of you have either experienced in your families or heard in the news, the pandemic has really taken a toll on the mental health of young people. And just as with adults, sometimes they turn to unhealthy coping strategies, such as alcohol or substance use, to help them get through tough times. Today, one of our faculty members, Dr. David Goldston, is going to share some general information about adolescent alcohol and substance use and discuss how we can talk about our teenagers and young adult children about these issues. He'll also provide information about how we can monitor their alcohol and substance use and advise us on when and how to seek treatment. Dr. Goldston is an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry. Sorry about that, I lost my spot. Dr. Goldston is a clinician, teacher, and researcher with special interests in youth suicidal behaviors and youth substance use. He's the director of the Duke Center for Adolescent and Young Adult Substance Use Treatment, which provides outpatient, intensive outpatient, evaluation, and consultation services regarding substance use among young people. Dr. Goldston is also the Duke Project Director for the UCLA National Child Traumatic Stress Network Center for Trauma-Informed Suicide, Self-Harm, and Substance Use Treatment and Prevention. And before I turn it over to Dr. Goldston, just a few quick notes about submitting questions today. You can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask a question at any time during the webinar, but we'll hold off on responding to questions until the end of Dr. Goldston's presentation. Please note that you do have the option to ask a question anonymously. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Goldston, and thank you, David, for being here today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wren, for inviting me to speak with everyone as part of this mental health webinar series. So let me share my screen. Can folks see this? Just let me know if you can.
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. So as Dr. Wren mentioned, I'm going to be speaking on the topic of adolescent alcohol and substance use this afternoon. I'm really going to touch on three different facets of this. Number one, I'd like to present some basic information about how often it is that, or how frequently adolescents actually use alcohol and substances. I would like to present some information also regarding how caregivers and parents can best address this with their young people. And lastly, I'd like to have a brief discussion regarding how do we know when this is becoming a problem and what are our treatment options. So these are some data in this first slide from the anonymously administered Youth Risk Behavior Survey. This is a survey that is administered in high schools throughout the country by the Centers for Disease Control. And the year 2019 was the last year for which data were available. And so these are pre-pandemic rates of alcohol and drug use. And as you can see here, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey surveys last year, and 21.7% of teenagers reported that they were current users of marijuana. Now, this includes everybody from somebody that's used, just once or twice socially or experimented to people that are using regularly, like multiple times a day. 29% used alcohol. About 14% reported periods of time when they had binge drinking episodes. 7% current prescription opioid misuse. And then there are lower frequencies for lifetime use of some harder drugs, such as 4% for cocaine, 2% for methamphetamine, 2% for lifetime heroin use. So there are several different things that I want to point out here. Number one is that there are significant numbers of teenagers that actually are using alcohol and drugs. With that said, it's certainly not all the kids that are using alcohol and drugs. And sometimes when we talk with our teenagers, they'll tell us that all of our friends and everybody at their high school uses alcohol or smokes marijuana or whatever. And it's really not the case. It's only about a fifth of teenagers that are reporting current marijuana use right now. So not all of the young people are doing this. That's not to say that the teenagers' perception is inaccurate in any way, because a lot of times when teenagers are using, they surround themselves with other peers that are using, and they quit having some of the same contacts with other peers that are not using. And so what they see is that everybody around them is using, and so it may appear that everybody's using these alcohol and different drugs. The second point I'd like to make is that over time, the rates of some of these alcohol and drugs have started to decrease. So current alcohol use, lifetime cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin use all decreased in the decade leading up to 2019. Marijuana was a little bit more complicated. The first half of the decade, it started to increase. I think that was concurrent with a little bit more discussion in the news about legalization and decriminalization, and then the rates started to go back to where they were before, with about a fifth reporting current marijuana use. Another point I really want to make, particularly about cannabis, is that the cannabis that maybe we, people my age or parents of young people had around us when we were growing up, is not the same drug that teenagers may be exposed to now. And as you can see from this slide, like I went to high school in 1976, I went to college in the 1980s. So in the mid 1970s, the DEA and seized marijuana samples. They looked at the THC potency and found that the THC potency in the mid 1970s was about 0.7%. By 2008, which is still 12 years ago, that was up to 7 to 8% of the potency. So it really increased like 7 to 8 fold, but it still wasn't anywhere where it is nearly what it is now. Today, some of the strongest current strains of marijuana out there that you can smoke are up to 30% THC potency. So significantly stronger than what was around, what was people were smoking and getting high with when we were growing up. And then if you get into the concentrates like the dabs, you can find that the percent THC is really 90% plus. The reason this is especially important, beside the fact it's almost qualitatively a different drug at these concentrations, is the fact that with higher levels of potency, you're much more likely to have symptoms or signs of dependence and withdrawal when people are using regularly, and then when they try to decrease their use of this. So it really is literally about 100 times more potent than it was back several decades ago. So reasons for use. Now, I'm sure everybody can guess at many of these, but obviously adolescence is a time for experimentation and risk-taking, and there are also there are social reasons. Kids get high together, and of course, just getting the euphoria, the good feeling goes along with using drugs. But we talk a little bit less about self-medication. And some young people are using because they want to feel better when they're depressed or when they're anxious or when they have distress associated with trauma reminders or reminders of trauma experiences. And the thing about this is that there are different short and long-term consequences, because the use of cannabis, for instance, may be effective in the short run as for calming down anxiety, as an example. But over the long run, if young people continue to use this in that way and start to use it more regularly, one of the things that we often see is that people's baseline level of anxiety will actually increase over time. And so they will get to the point where then they start to almost become panicky or have a higher baseline level of anxiety and have a difficult time feeling normal or functioning unless they're actually using cannabis. So it can have this paradoxical long-term effect. It's the same thing, for instance, happens with depression. People may drink when they're feeling depressed, but alcohol is a depressant. And so it can have longer term effects of being associated with depression. And there similarly can be a situation with trauma reminders where people can try to use drugs to calm themselves down when they're exposed to reminders of trauma experiences, but over the long run, they can start to become more distressed or find themselves in risky situations where the risk of re-victimization is higher. And so there are these complicated relationships, but the kids are usually motivated primarily by the short-term consequences. And that's why they're driven to this. And just kind of building on this developmentally, it's really important to note that those areas of the brain that are associated with reward systems and emotional responses tend to mature before those associated with decision-making and consideration of the longer-term consequences and judgment. So it kind of makes sense that young people are drawn to things that make them feel good in the short run without thinking more about the longer-term consequences. So what's going on during this time of COVID? So some of the emerging data has shown that there are a greater proportion of individuals who are using substances to cope with the stresses of COVID. There's been an increase in overdoses. There are many stresses that have become more pronounced during this pandemic. For instance, people are more socially isolated. There's less structure in some people's lives if they've had disruption in their jobs or in their schools, and maybe they have lack of access to normal activities that would usually be alternatives to alcohol and drug use. Sometimes, just being at home constantly can be a source of stress if, their relationships with family members are kind of estranged, or there's a lot of conflict here. So there are a lot of reasons why during the pandemic, there's some increased stresses and reasons why people may be drawn to drugs and to try to help to use this as an effective coping strategy for them. Another important point to make is that some forms of treatment and support they're really more difficult to access during COVID. There are some areas of treatment that have been suspended. There are some 12-step groups that have been suspended or maybe all gone virtual, and maybe some people, for example, prefer in-person sources of treatment. And so that's really been hard for many people. The move to virtual treatment, on the one hand, it may be a really good thing for some people, because it may increase access and maybe easier. Maybe some people might feel more comfortable actually logging in by telehealth to be in a telehealth session. But it also may exacerbate disparities in care, because to really have effective telehealth, you really have to have a good internet connection or a good cell plan and that type of thing. And then the last point I want to make about COVID is that sometimes people with individuals with substance use disorders, they actually may be more likely to get COVID and to have COVID-related complications. So it's kind of a complicated relationship, but the pandemic has really exacerbated some of the issues we've had as a society in dealing with substance use. So as parents, how do we know, what are some of the warning signs about alcohol and substance use? So the most direct evidence are just the signs that you see when observing, when interacting with young people, such as blurry eyes, smells of drug and alcohol, and those type of things. There are other indirect signs. None of these in and of itself is sufficient to indicate that your teenager has a problem with alcohol and drugs, but looking at these together, you can look at clustering of these issues to raise questions about what's going on with your teenager. But worsening mood, including depression and anxiety, can be associated with alcohol and substance use, along with more noncompliance, secretiveness, sneaking out, decreases in grades, less motivation, changes in sleep patterns, especially changes in peer groups, worsening conflict or negative changes in the parent-child relationship. And as you can see, this is at the bottom of this, the slides will be posted on the website, but a lot of this is available from the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. So some of the things that are really important for parents in terms of just addressing issues of alcohol and substance use with teenagers is the most important thing is really to keep open and supportive communication with the teenagers. It's okay to ask youth directly about what they know about alcohol and drugs, what their experience are being around this, with their friends, or what are they hearing about this. I think it's also really, really important for parents to remain calm and share that it's okay to talk about this subject, because I've heard this repeatedly from teenagers that they did not want to bring this up for parents because they were afraid their parents were going to freak out and get anxious about this. And so it's really important to reinforce the fact that you really care about them and that it's safe for them to be able to go to you and talk to you about some of these issues, about what's going on with them. It's also really important to balance these messages of openness and trying to understand, and you're caring about them, with you stating what your expectations as a family are about the use of substances and any concerns that you may have, but not in such a way that it kind of closes off those avenues for communication. One thing we've also found really helpful with young people, particularly as they start to go to social gatherings, parties and such, is for parents to talk with the kids directly and come up with ways in which the young people can signal their parents that they need to get out of the situation where there are substances that are involved. So if they can somehow text like an emoji or something to their parents, they know that their parents need to call them in front of their peers and let them know that they're going to pick them up and that type of thing. But to have a sign that just the teenagers and the parents know sometimes is really helpful. The other thing, just as part of monitoring is not just like playing policeman and checking up on the kid everywhere. I mean, so much of this is just communicating, knowing where your kid is going, that type of thing. But a big part of this also is spending quality time with your child. So you are providing the opportunity to actually have these discussions. And then this again is a document. Our National Child Traumatic Stress Network Center helped put together this for military families and caregivers. And we have a lot of information there, but it's relevant really to all families. So here are some pointers on when alcohol and substance use become a problem. Well, first of all, a really good argument can be made that among young people growing up with developing brains, it's never really a totally safe thing. And almost always, we don't really know as much as we should about the long-term consequences for developing brains for introducing alcohol and substance use. But over and beyond that, if we think about when does something need to have treatment or maybe professional attention, there are issues such as, is the youth using large amounts over longer periods of time? Are they spending a lot more time trying to take, or recover from substances? Are there instances where the youths are trying to use more than intended? Have there been failed attempts to quit or cut back? And has there been impairment in any number of areas? Are they missing class? Do they have decreasing motivation, declining grades? Have there been legal charges or close calls that could have resulted in arrest? Is there depression worsening? Is there anxiety worsening? Are they starting to have concentration and memory problems? Cannabis also is associated with onset of psychosis. So have there been those type of mental health problems? Has there been decreased contact with past peers or estrangement in relations with some peers? Has there been more conflict in the home, more secretiveness, more sneaking out? Has the youth been spending lots of money on alcohol and drugs and using money on alcohol and drugs that they usually would have been either saving or using in other more productive ways? These are all things that you can look for to determine when alcohol and substance use is really becoming a problem and an issue that needs professional attention. So here are some of the common treatment modalities and approaches. Peer support, of course, is a central part of 12-step groups. This actually fostering positive peer support is common to many treatment approaches. Motivational enhancement is really important because a lot of young people have some ambivalence about alcohol and drug use. There's part of them that may realize that they're starting to have problems, but on the other hand, they don't really want to quit because they enjoy this or their friends are using this and that type of thing. Cognitive behavioral therapy relapse prevention. This is a cognitive behavioral therapy is an approach that's used for a variety of problems, but helping people to understand the behavioral patterns, the thoughts, the triggers that lead to substance use, and learn from these paths and trajectories that lead up into substance use, so we can learn from those and learn how to prevent these patterns in the future. Dialectical behavioral therapy is a specific form of cognitive behavioral therapy that has a very nice framework for skills development that can be very useful in addressing substance use. Contingency management is important, and this is usually operated by parents. For example, there could be administration of urine drug tests when the kid has been having trouble with alcohol and drug tests, and there could be privileges that are rewarded or actually incentives that are given based on whether or not young people are reducing their alcohol and drug use. Family therapy is important as a way of helping to increase support for young people, and often, particularly for more severe problems, or often co-occurring problems such as alcohol and such as depression and anxiety. And it's really important to have this integrated treatment approach that focuses on all of that. Some of the principles of effective recovery or stimulus control. This really refers to, for example, reducing access to substances so it's not as tempting, so it's not as around, so you're not going to be in situations where you're going to have triggers for urges and cravings. Identifying the functions of use and the triggers, that is what are the situations when you're most likely to have cravings to want to use, and why are you using these things, and then trying to use that information to build alternative behaviors to substance use and alternative skills for coping. It's really important when somebody has had a substance use problem to expect that recovery may not be a straight line. There may be setbacks, and when those lapses occur, it's important not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, to say that none of this work we've done this far has been helpful, but to get back with a sense of self-efficacy, try to get back on board with the program and try to learn from those lapses and build that into the therapeutic process. It's really important to have positive social support and clean social support, and to focus on one day at a time. And the identification of your values is really important, because many young people, despite what they're doing, they have some ideas of what they would like to do with their lives. And then if you start to help them articulate these, they can consider whether or not their current pattern is consistent or inconsistent with that. The different levels of care, these include the peer support, such as 12-step groups or smart recovery groups. We have our Duke works with school diversion programs when kids get called into school to help provide psychoeducation and counseling as part of their avenue to get back into school when they've been suspended. We have regular outpatient care, intensive outpatient program, which at Duke is 9 hours of care a week over set across 3 days a week, with group therapy, family and individual therapy. We also have ties to residential care when people need to go somewhere and have more intensive care for 3 to 6 months. And of course, when people are coming out of residential care, particularly some young adults, sometimes having transitional living arrangements or sober living arrangements is really helpful for some young people. So here's some resources I wanted to share with everyone. This is the information for our phone number in case anybody has feel free to call this number if you have any questions about referrals. We have a triage line for the Department of Psychiatry and several other links here provided by SAMHSA and NIDA and the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. So thank you very much. And the last slide, I just really wanted to thank our fantastic CAST team here, the substance use treatment team for adolescents and young adults here at Duke. And these are all my colleagues. We have a wonderful team, and I wanted to acknowledge them. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Golston. That was really wonderful and really such helpful information. So let's see if we have any questions from our attendees. And please remember that you can also ask a question anonymously. Any questions from our participants? Give people a minute to think about that, because I'll ask you a question, Dr. Golston. You had mentioned for the young people, there can be certainly some anxiety or fear of letting their parents know that they're having a difficult time, or particularly if substances are involved. I was just curious from the perspective of the parents, their own struggle of coming to terms if their child is having this difficulty, maybe feeling some responsibility, not being good parents, some shame about that, how to manage some of those reactions and feelings.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, sometimes there's so many things, parents, there's so much heterogeneity in how people can react to these type of things. But, on the one hand, I think the part of the key to this is realizing the importance of boundaries. Parents have to realize they don't have complete control over their kids. And their kids are not, as much as we've grown up thinking this, are not simply an extension of us. And they have their own minds and they're going to do what they're going to do. And it's our job to help steer them in the right direction and help monitor and do what we can, but we can't ultimately control everything they're going to do. It is also parents' jobs, not necessarily to, as much as we'd like this, not necessarily to be the best friends, of the teenagers. Sometimes that puts us into trouble because then we're afraid we want to just accommodate, or we're afraid to bring up things that may be conflictual. And sometimes there's a place for parents to set limits and to have difficult conversations. But it's really important for parents to maybe come to the terms with their initial reactions, and it's legitimate to have those reactions and important to recognize that, but to see what they can do to kind of set those aside and help them be grounded before they start to have these kind of conversations with these teenagers. Because like anxiety is contagious. And you have a kid that's anxious, you have a parent that's anxious from the same room, is not an additive thing, it's a multiplicative thing in terms of the level of anxiety that's in the room. And they need to be approached from a place where they're going to feel very calm and as though they can react in a calm way. And that may be not bringing this up immediately, and it may be talking to others before we're ready to do this. And the other thing I'd like to bring up is never a great idea to have a really long confrontive conversation with a kid right when you think they're high. That's not the time. Everything is too hot, and you can raise questions then and then say, we're going to talk about this later. But it's not an ideal time when somebody's under the influence to have long conversations, and long confrontations are actually not all that helpful anyway. We need to kind of listen and then deliver consequences in a matter-of-fact way, and to just try to have that opening and those open channels.
Right. And you can also see that, you see that in the media, right? Sort of different movies and so forth, showing the parent confronting the young person when they are intoxicated and so forth. So that's not something to do, right? As you're saying.
It rarely works well.
Right. And the other thing I think is important, because I've heard you speak before and about your program, there is that family support to your program. So support for the parents as well as they sort of embark in this process of helping their young person.
Yeah, particularly in our intensive outpatient program. Well, for all of our outpatient services, we try to involve families, but particularly for intensive outpatient programs, we, for instance, have a multifamily group.
Yeah,
Is a central part of that. Even though we're meeting virtually, we do that. And when we meet in person, we also had a parent support group that was running concurrently to the groups.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Goldston. This is really terrific information. And unfortunately, the time has just flown by and we're already out of time, and we could spend a lot more time talking on this topic. I would like to note to everyone attending that the recording from the first two webinars in the series is now available on our webpage. I'd like to again thank Dr. Goldston for his time and expertise, and thanks to all of our attendees for joining us. We invite you to join our next event, which will be held Wednesday, March 31st at 4 p.m., which will focus on suicide prevention. Our speaker will be Dr. Nate Kimbrell. Our series will include 3 more webinars that will explore different aspects of mental health, as well as we seek tools and support during these challenging times. Information about the upcoming webinars and recordings and resources from past webinars are available at the link in the chat. You can also submit questions in advance of the upcoming webinar at this link. I want to end by noting that if you are struggling, please know that you are not alone. We encourage and invite you to seek support. Resources, including our department's emotional support and well-being phone line, are listed at the bottom of the webinar series page. Please take care, and we hope to see you at our future webinars. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.